मैं चाहूँगा जोरदार तालियों से उनका मंच पे स्वागत करें, अभिनंदन करें. Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji is an economist and civil servant and was former deputy chairman of the erstwhile Planning Commission, Government of India. Indeed. He joined the government in 1979 as economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance, after which he held a series of positions including Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs, Finance Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, member of the Planning Commission and member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. In February 2020, he published his book, Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years, an insider's account on policy making from 1985 to 2014. For his outstanding contribution to economic policy and public service, he was conferred with the prestigious Padma Vibhushan in 2011, India's second highest civilian award for exceptional and distinguished services. Sir, we are extremely elated to have you. I would request you to please take your seat on the dais. And as a discussion for this session, we are happy to have Rajiv Kumar ji with us. Unke liye bhi taaliyan honi chahiye. Rajiv Kumar ji is an economist and author who was till now the vice chairman of the Niti Aayog, the key think tank for the government of India. He has served as chief economist at CII and as secretary general of FICCI, the two apex business associations. He has also been an independent director on the Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India and the State Bank of India. His books include Modi and His Challenges and Exploding Aspirations, Unlocking India's Future. I would request both the gentlemen to please begin the discussion.
I'll just make a quick announcement that this is indeed a very unique and rare session, which will rare for the country itself, that two stalwarts in the economic and policy making field, Montek Singh Ahluwalia Saab, in one regime of the government of India, was replaced by Mr. Rajiv Kumar in another regime of the government of India. Both of them together on the dais. It's a great occasion. Please give them a very big hand.
Good morning, everybody. And thanks, Raghav, and thanks the organizers for inviting me here. And I think this is, probably the best opportunity to express my gratitude to Montek, because coming back from Oxford in 1982, my colleague at that time, Isha, invited us, Vinita and me, to their apartment in 1982 in Moti Bagh. And Jagdish Bhagwati was in town, and Mrinal Datta Chaudhary was there. And that's the beginning of my association with you, Montek, 40 years ago. And then, of course, I had the privilege of working with him in the Department of Economic Affairs. So a good long 40 years association, culminating in this wonderful event where I'm introducing your book. So thanks for that, and great opportunity to be here. I want to take you back, Montek, to 1991-92, and when you were in charge and you were Secretary of Department of Economic Affairs, and ask you the question is, we started the reforms at that time, big time reforms, and at that time China and India were probably at the same level in economic development. Per capita income, I think, in India was slightly higher than in China, very small amount. What do you think, looking back, we couldn't do that they have done, which today means that they are now 6 times our size, and the per capita income is that equally large. We started the reforms, and so what I'm asking is that, looking back now, what are the 1, 2, 3 things that if we had gotten right or better than what we did, we could have also done equally well?
Well, that's a difficult. Can I be heard? Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to answer a question, what could we have been doing or what could we have done that would make us like China. I mean, it's certainly true that India and China were kind of low-income countries. My guess is, by the way, that we were roughly the same income level in 1980 by 1991, they had actually pretty much outstripped us because their reforms started in 1978. But I think it's also true that their reforms were much more single-mindedly driven by the desire to make China a much stronger country and were not constrained in any way by domestic opposition. Now, we are, of course, proud of having domestic opposition because you can't be a democracy and say, well, no, we shouldn't have domestic opposition. So the skill in China was very much, let's find out what's the best way of going ahead. And it's wrong to say, by the way, that the Chinese didn't consult. They consulted very extensively. And in the course of, I mentioned this in my book, Backstage, that at one point they brought a whole bunch of economists from Europe, from Hungary, the former communist countries, including Americans, and put them on a luxury cruise up the Yangtze, okay, and discussed how should China liberalize. And after this discussion, a very important conclusion that they arrived at was that what the Hungarians were saying, which is sort of a little bit of this and a little bit of that, is the right way to go, was wrong, and that what the Americans were saying, which is forget about all this, if you're serious, go the whole hog, was right. And Deng Xiaoping made the decision, and then he managed the party within. You know, the Chinese democracy is all within the top Politburo. I mean, they do discuss, somebody wins, then for the next 5 years he has complete control. Now, we were not in that position at all. I think by 1991, it was very clear to us that India had been non-performing. Now, it had been non-performing primarily, in my view, in the 1970s. You know, in the early 60s, India's performance was not that bad compared to other countries. And what India was doing was not regarded by the experts as the wrong thing to do. But towards the end of the 1960s, which is really when Korea, Southeast Asia, and others showed that the world is expanding, and if you can integrate with the world, there are huge benefits. I think we didn't learn that lesson. And the 1980s were full of little reforms here and there, which didn't add up to an end. They did improve performance compared to the past, but not dramatically. And I think what 91 did was we were, for a variety of reasons, a combination of people involved, a combination of circumstances, because the crisis was very important. I mean, it's, you know, in a world in which you couldn't go and buy whatever import you wanted, and you had to get some wretched license from the Commerce Ministry, if the country is down to 2 weeks of reserves, I mean, I remember as Commerce Secretary calling up the Finance Ministry and saying, look, here's an exporter who says, look, if I can have whatever $100,000 of imports now, I will be bringing in $400,000 of export earnings. And the Finance Ministry would say, well, look, the Reserve Bank says the reserves have run out, so we can't do it. It made us realize that this is idiotic. And therefore, there was a consensus that something has to give. Yep. And I think the big thing in 91 was essentially what I would say dismantling controls. These controls were ridiculous. They had been put in before the war by the colonial government, and even in Britain they had similar controls in order to fight the war. I mean, in the United States, for example, you know, automotive firms were told that, look, boys, forget about automotives, produce tanks. And governments intervene when you have a war situation, when it's very clear that in the next 6 months, the important thing is to get X done, it doesn't matter what the cost is. Now, they got rid of these controls as soon as the war ended, but we continued with them.
Yeah.
And that getting rid of controls was a big thing that 91 did.
Yeah. That's great.
That was good. I mean, it had effect, but it took a long time.
And I remember those days very clearly because you and Shankar had made me in charge of the balance of payments, and I had to report every week, the state of the week. But coming back to the sort of the one thing that you said just now, that the Chinese didn't have any opposition to what they were doing and the reforms, etc. Now, in a democracy, of course, there will be opposition, but there is also therefore the role of the public narrative. and how to inform that narrative, how to turn that narrative, etc. And that's where the role supposedly of the think tanks and of the of the academia and of the sort of universities and sort of comes in, and also the media. Now, how, having been so long in the policy making thing, how do you see that role having played out in India? Because I mean, I now know that even today, and the Prime Minister sort of when the farm laws were done, came back to us and said one of the big reasons was that the public narrative hadn't been turned in the favor of the reform that we were doing. Now, have these constituents played the role that you expected of them? Did they influence policy, you think, in any way? Or I know that in the 80s, we in ICRIA were doing a lot of this work, and some of this led to the 90s, contributed to that. Is that happening? Is that something a way forward for creating this consensus among the people for the support of reforms?
Mm-hmm. No, I think what you say about narrative is extremely important. Many people think that Dr. Manmohan Singh's speech as the finance minister in 1991 was historic. Okay. Now, interestingly, it wasn't historic because of what he announced. What was announced in the budget was actually very little, because all the stuff had been done before that. What was historic about his speech, and I even recommend to those young people who worry about these things, I think there are some young people around, no? How many people here under the age of 40? Oh, there's quite a lot. So most of you were too young at the time of 91 reforms. Pull out Manmohan Singh's budget speech for 91 and read it, because it's an exposition of what we've already done. Every budget speech after that, including his own and Chidambaram and everybody else, fell into the trap of saying, I'm going to outline things. And therefore, they usually ended up announcing 10 different programs. Every speech would announce 7 different programs. Nobody would ever follow these programs after they were announced. This thing actually said why we need to do things differently. There have been such announcements made, but you should look at that. And I think the narrative has to be built around the change we need. Now, what Rajiv says, it's true that the farm laws narrative was totally supported by most of the think tanks, certainly supported by me. I had written a note for the then Punjab government saying, look, you need to do this. But I think for some reason, the way the narrative unfolded, the think tanks didn't actually come out there and say, look, this is really good. Okay? I think part of the problem is, where are think tanks important? In China, they have internal party things and they consult extensively. Think tanks are really important in the United States. And one thing you have to remember is that think tanks in the United States are not full of people who are hoping to get laterally inducted into the bureaucracy. They are full of people who don't actually want to be in the lower bureaucracy. But they're saying, look, when my guy gets elected, maybe I'll come in at the top. Now, unfortunately, our think tanks, we have almost no think tank, which is people by guys who say, look, this is the narrative I subscribe to. You, if you're in the government and power, I accept that you're nationalists and you're well-meaning, but that you don't seem to be of this narrative. So even if I'm offered a job, I won't go in there. Okay? Most people will say, let's work from inside. And I can understand that in our system. But I think we don't have think tanks that are, in that sense, truly independent. Maybe some are emerging. So in fact, most of our think tanks pride themselves on being technical and not political. Personally, I would like to see more politically aligned think tanks on all sides.
On all sides.
I mean, that's a
and I think that's a great message to the youngsters, which is that coming in the next 25 years, as we go towards our centenary and so on, we need this think tank and this intervention to try and build a consensus on what India could do to achieve the rates of growth that we need, as it were.
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, look, it was I don't mean to denigrate the 91 reforms, since I had some role in it. I have every incentive to say, oh, they were great reforms, and I think they were. But they were pretty obvious. I mean, anyone coming from outside, we had the most ridiculous controls, okay? So it was a no-brainer to get rid of those things. And it was done very quickly, okay? Since then, things have become a little more complicated. I mean, for example, today, let's take today. I think one of the important things that the present government has done, which I agree with, is that, look, public sector ownership should be restricted only to a few strategic sectors, okay? For the rest, privatize. It's good. It's not happening. No. And nor is any think tank saying, why isn't it happening? I mean, look, we have so many Ashoka hotels. Now, whatever you may think is strategic, no one in his right mind thinks that hotels are strategic. This has been going on now for several years, so somebody has to raise the question. I've not seen a single think tank raise this simple
exactly.
issue.
I mean, and this
why?
I say this because I actually informally contacted some, because I chaired the committee to recommend the candidates for privatization to the government, and it was blocked, and it didn't go forward, etc., etc. But here there's another issue which you referred to actually in your book about, I think the incident you talk about is food grain hoarding at one time, excesses and so on. And you make the statement there that the officials did not agree, to your suggestion. Just 1 second. I'm bringing this up simply to say that I found the same thing in my 5 years, which is that officials very often won't agree, for example, in this case, to privatization, and these things won't happen, despite the political direction, if you like, despite, the clear message and so on. Now, how can this change? How does this change?
Yeah.
One is the role of the think tanks, but what else can be done?
Well, actually, it's a very good example that you refer to, because I think I mentioned in the book that, the conventional notion whenever food prices went up was that you must impose the Essential Commodities Act because the hoarders are hoarding grain. And I said in one cabinet committee meeting that, look, the biggest hoarder is the government of India, because we had built up excess food grains of more than 30 million tons. And we didn't have the skill required in the bureaucracy to actually offload them, okay? And the reason it wouldn't get it's not true that the bureaucrats didn't want to offload, but they were concerned that if they offloaded the grain at a price lower than the market price, then they would be accused of having favored some grain trader. But the whole point was to bring the price lower than the market price. So the idea that you would lower the price by keeping your grain price above is just ridiculous. And frankly, I still feel that it's possible for the political system to take the responsibility and create a structure where the final decision doesn't rest with the bureaucrat. And actually, we should allow the bureaucrats to put in cautionary words. Like, for example, a bureaucrat could say that, the consensus amongst this committee, of which I'm the chairman, is that we should do this. However, I must warn that, the left will oppose it, this fellow will oppose it, the other fellow will oppose it. Cabinet may kindly take a view. In that case, he can never be accused of having done it, and I can guarantee you, whichever government, they will never accuse the whole cabinet of having done it. One of the most fundamental weaknesses in our system is that under the rules of business, Ministry A cannot take a note to the cabinet on a subject which belongs to Ministry B. So even if the finance ministry believes that we should offload 20 million tons of grain, what will happen is there'll be a discussion, and the food ministry or the civil supplies guys will be asked to bring a note to the cabinet. But the point is, they're the ones who are uncertain about doing this. So I think we need, the big change that occurred in 91 was, and I think I talk about this in the book too, many things have to be done keeping in mind that the end result depends on what others do. For example, the Commerce Ministry ostensibly is responsible for promoting exports. The Commerce Ministry is not responsible for fixing tariffs. That is the job of the finance ministry. Now, it may well be the case, this was our argument then, that by raising tariffs, they had made the Indian economy uncompetitive, okay? And therefore, exports were hurt. And whenever the Commerce Ministry was told that exports are hurt, they would come back and say, I think we should increase the export subsidy, because that's what they controlled. Now, actually, what they should have said is, look, we got an average tariff of, in those days, some ridiculous number, 80% or so. And frankly, we should lower the average tariff to 25% and let the exchange rate be depreciated. Now, this they couldn't do either, because the exchange rate is something that the finance ministry controls. This is exactly what we managed to do in 1991, because we didn't leave these things to individual ministries. And I think that if the government set up a core group that is responsible collectively for coming to a solution, and then encourage, I think the other thing is we should encourage the narrative to be spelt out by bureaucrats, not necessarily the politician. A narrative spelt out by bureaucrats protects the politician. You know, and I think you need that, but I think we're not. That doesn't seem to be the way we've evolved. So these are the ways in which a policy issue can get surfaced. It's also true, by the way, if you allow the bureaucrat to spell out the narrative, the press will be happier condemning the bureaucrat. The press is not very comfortable, understandably, condemning political side. So, in order to get a real discussion of what is at issue, I think that's what we need.
Yeah, yeah. One take on the 2003 to 2011 period. Probably been the best 8 years that Indian
Yes.
economy ever had. 8.5%, nearly 8.5%. And you say that in your book, growth peaks in the UPA, and you have a chapter there on that. Question to you is that how much of that growth would you attribute to the reforms done in the previous NDA government under Yashwant Sinha, under Vajpayee's government, N.K. Singh as the economic advisor to the PM, etc. Is there because I find that that's something which I think maybe merits a discussion, because it also conveys continuity, which you talk about later on in case of Aadhaar, for example, that the UPA started and then the NDA took it up. So why isn't there in our country a kind of a narrative which says that, look, successive governments have done this and they've taken the country that far? So what is your view on what is the NDA
I'm totally, I think in my book I say very clearly that while the 91 reforms were watershed, I give credit to both the United Front, which was there for 3 years, and the 6-year Vajpayee government for having continued the reforms. In fact, the strength of India does not, in my view, lie in portraying a narrative which says that every government that comes in is going to say that everything that was done before was wrong. I mean, you can say that they were incompetent. The best thing to say is that they were corrupt, because that, doesn't hurt anybody, and you just, but the best image of India would be that, look, it's a very noisy democracy, because it's very multifarious. But underneath it, there is a strong consensus for steady progress. That is the best narrative that we can portray, and I think it's absolutely true that the high growth during the UPA years cannot be attributed just to what the UPA did. I mean, clearly they were building on a continuing set of reforms from 91 onwards, absolutely true. I do say that one of the strong points in the 91 reforms, it was getting out in the UPA period. One was to get out of what looked like a negative perception by the Americans, annoyed at our nuclear test, which was actually done by Vajpayee ji, and had broad political support. But cancelling the American anti position was, I think, important. Yep. And the Indo-US nuclear deal, which was initiated in 2005 and then completed around 2008, that was a very important signal which led to one of the critical factors in in the Western world saying India is okay.
India is okay,
That's
yeah.
a very big thing. Second, I think the fiscal deficit performance during UPA was pretty good. Otherwise, the only thing the UPA didn't do, because of the left support, they stopped talking about privatization, which I think is a mistake. But anyway, not much was happening, but they didn't talk about it. Otherwise, because Manmohan Singh had initiated the 91 reforms, most people thought my policy is going to be broadly supportive and created a bit of an investment boom and so on. I think another factor, which is a continuing factor, really from 91 onwards, is the opening up of the capital market. Now, we greatly underestimate the importance of that. A lot of people say that a criticism of the 91 reforms is that they were product market reforms and they didn't go to factor markets. Now, that's true for land and labor. That's still true, actually. But it's not true for capital, because the 91 reforms very clearly opened up for foreign capital in a gradual way. And later on, the liberalization on banking, which again was pushed by the Vajpayee government and continued by the UPA, opened up private banking. And then non-bank finance companies, many of them ran into trouble. But today, what you're now seeing as startups, which is a new phenomenon during this government, the groundwork for this was laid earlier when the capital market was opened up. Yep. And you built a certain credibility of the Indian capital market. So these are, I think, the trouble is, if a narrative gives credit to the continuity of reforms, I think it strengthens the reputation of India. If the narrative only says that, look, what I'm doing is what counts, it's a bit like, well, Bibek de Broy in this fascinating discussion that preceded ours talks about, we shouldn't have a linear view and so on.
Yeah.
A linear view can also be a relatively longer-term
view.
The things that you started in the 1990s begin to have an effect in 2000, 2010. Yeah. And that is something there in the
you mentioned about the fiscal deficit performance of UPA 1, which was very credible. But I recall, and I was trying to look for that in your book actually, the 2008 budget, which preceded the Lehman crisis.
Yes.
In fact, I wrote a column saying at that time that the finance minister actually was so good that he anticipated the Lehman crisis because he, if you remember, in that budget, the fiscal deficit jumped up 2.5% of GDP. With all the three things, the farm loan waivers, the salary scheme, and the others, all came together. And I was just wondering, what was your advice to the finance minister at that time, and how you and the prime minister, two eminent economists at that time, took to that opening of the floodgates of fiscal deficit at that time?
That's very good. Actually, if you want to be a critic of the then finance minister, and I think for students I should mention this, a lot of people criticized the 2008 budget for not factoring in some of the sort of pay commission stuff which you knew was coming. So in a way, part of the increase was already there. You knew it was going to be there. But when the Lehman crisis hit, I think I mentioned this.
But the budget happened before the Lehman crisis.
Yes, but when the Lehman crisis itself hit, I mean, we all knew this was a bit of a black swan event, sort of like the pandemic, although less damaging ultimately. And Dr. Manmohan Singh said, look, we're seeing a meltdown in the global financial system, and we need some advice by people who really know. And he called a meeting at which he invited, and I was invited. Of course, the finance minister was there. The governor of the Reserve Bank was there. That was Subbarao at that time. He had just taken over from Rangarajan. And he invited Rangarajan, who was the chairman of his Economic Advisory Council. It was and me, and a group of people who each of them probably thought they were really quite knowledgeable. But Dr. Manmohan Singh was quite aware that, while he's pooling the domestic knowledge, he said, maybe these guys don't know as much as they think. So he said to me, what is Raghuram Rajan doing these days? So I said, well, he's just left the IMF and gone back to teach at the Booth School in Chicago. So Dr. Manmohan Singh said, why don't you write to him and say, I want a note from him on what should India do? And I think his concern was, he would be most aware of how the rest of the world would look at what we are doing. And you know, in the world of finance, it's not enough to get it right. It's important to have a narrative that the sort of guys who decide to rush in or rush out also think you're right. And it was interesting. Raghu gave the advice that don't expand the fiscal deficit, but tighten monetary policy. Okay? I didn't agree with that. I mean, I felt that in our system, the transmission route from fiscal to the rest of the economy was much more gummed up than in the West. And if we wanted to give a boost, we ought to do more on the fiscal side. So the then Planning Commission was very much more on the fiscal side. I think that in the end, by then the finance minister had changed. Minister Mukherjee had become, because Chidambaram moved out to Home Ministry, you know, after the Bombay terrorist attacks. And Mukherjee accepted the advice that we should have a bit more expansionary budget. And he even said that, look, we're going to we do this for one more year, but then we'll contract. His mistake was he didn't contract. And frankly, a lot of the problems we had, high inflation, was due to that.
But I mean, I was going to say that, don't you think the problem started with the 2008 budget and then continued and then stoked up the inflation?
No, not at all, because in my view, as you yourself said, that for 2008 and 2009, it was the right thing to do to expand the deficit. But you do it, you have to make sure that you reverse course. Now, I think one of his mistakes was, instead of expanding the deficit by bringing in more capital expenditure, he lowered taxes. That's a disaster. If any of you, when some of you will no doubt become finance ministers, please remember this advice. If you want to have a temporary stimulus, do it on the expenditure side, because you can always not do the expenditure next year. It'll be a disaster if you lower taxes, because you have to be Superman or something to raise them again. And that's the mistake he made. He gave an unduly large reduction in tax rate, which he was never willing to actually reverse. So a very specific response. I think the rise in the... Not everybody, by the way, agrees with me. My good friend Shankar Acharya constantly criticizes us that we shouldn't have expanded that much. But you know, the Indian fiscal deficit expansion for the first 2 years was not very different from China. China expanded a lot. Our mistake was that we didn't contract.
But we continued.
And the problem is we don't have a narrative. We don't have any think tank tracking this. There's no public narrative which will point the finger at someone and say, you are walking into a fiscal disaster. I mean, that's why you get all these reveries and all proliferating, no? And nobody's criticizing it.
Yeah, because it continues the past tradition, the past practice, isn't it? In that sense.
Yeah, but you know, the point is, in the past, we were not an open economy. I mean, look, we are now highly dependent on inflows, not just of capital, even remittances. I mean, if you're not a linked economy, you don't have to worry about the international narrative.
Yeah.
If you are, I mean, please be aware that all these people who are remitting, they're remitting $100 billion into India every year.
Yeah.
And if they read in the Wall Street Journal that, you know, the economy is badly managed, most of them will invest it abroad for a while.
Yeah, yeah. So what's the reason that you think that the reform momentum and also then the growth momentum kind of stalled during the second tenure of the UPA, the second term of the UPA?
I don't know that it's stalled, by the way. I mean, the average growth rate of the UPA, including the slowdown in the last 3 years, was still 7.8%, which is pretty good.
But in the last 3 years was about less than 5.
No, in the last 3 years it had dipped a bit, but in the very last year it shot up to 6.4.
Again, yeah.
So actually,
but do you think the reform agenda continued in the UPA?
No, I have said in my book quite clearly that there was a loss of momentum. And I think the loss of momentum...
what do you attribute that to?
In the UPA.
What do you attribute that to?
I mean, look, I think it was a coalition government. I don't think they lost control, in my view, of the narrative. They didn't really appreciate, I think, they didn't really appreciate, particularly when these allegations of corruption mounted, that with TV and electronics and so on, you can't respond by Press Information Bureau and that kind of stuff.
But
Maybe they didn't do that because this was coalition.
Montek, you don't think that the role of the National Advisory Council, which was chaired by Mrs. Gandhi, had any role in terms of, doing a different thing, taking a different view of how the economy should be managed, and therefore focusing much more on the distribution rather than on growth?
Let's put it this way, that was a new force ostensibly representing CSO interests. What did the National Advisory Council actually do? One is the Right to Information Act. I think that was a good thing to do. They had a push on the food security.
Food security, yeah.
I was not in favor, and I say so in the book. They were extending the food subsidy to far too many people. We managed to reduce it a little, but look, I was saying, listen, poverty is down by then to about 22%. So give the cheaper food to 40%. There's no justice. They wanted 75. We managed to lower it to 66%. That's not a huge disaster. It's a bit unnecessarily expensive. I think, I don't know that the NAC itself did not play any role in things like, the holding up of projects. Because of it. Not as an NAC, but some of the individuals in it may have said, but that civil society exists even today. They were not operating through the NAC. And I think this is a huge problem any government will face. I'm sure the present government, when it does land acquisition, faces the same protest. We need a narrative. We need more people getting up and saying, look, the good this will do vastly offsets any cost it imposes. More importantly, usually these land acquisitions involve compensation, and the problem is that compensation is never paid. So actually the solution is to make sure that it's paid.
Yeah.
There's no justification for taking away land, promising compensation, and then for the next 15 years the guys don't get it. That's the real problem.
Let me ask you another question, and my 5 years in Niti Aayog have got me one very important lesson, which is that anything which is done at the pan-India level, central planning, plans, this, that, and the other, or policy like exim policy, having the same exim policy for the Punjab and for Tamil Nadu, for me doesn't make sense at all. But you've headed 11th and 12th 5-year plans and so on. And remember Professor Raj Krishna saying, oh, this is the 8th version of the same plan, if you remember that said. Now, do you now think that we continued with central planning commission for far too long, and we should have encouraged more state-specific policy formation and development
There's
planning?
no question in my mind that we need much greater flexibility to the states. I don't think, by the way, that we were reducing that flexibility. There's an image that the Planning Commission was doing all the detailed sectoral controls. That's not true. The role of the Planning Commission was to listen to states, and I think we were, at that time, a strong lobby, both for doing central government push for infrastructure projects, okay? Mm-hmm. And we were the principal people saying, look, let's do it through PPP. And we were also keen to get states to do it through PPP. In fact, Madhya Pradesh, somebody was telling me yesterday, Madhya Pradesh is a good example where they had a lot of interaction with the Planning Commission on how to do things in Madhya Pradesh with PPP, which they succeeded. And we pushed others, like, for example, Andhra Pradesh, the metro. Our view was that the metros should be done PPP and not by the state and central government. So that part is valid. It's also true that we were a very strong, we didn't succeed, but we were a strong force for saying that, look, if you're going to assist the states developmentally, then give them flexible developmental grants, maybe for particular sectors, but do not design those projects in the center. I'll give you a very simple example which I was directly involved in, which I think succeeded quite well. We wanted something for agriculture. So we had a huge number of centrally sponsored schemes. Centrally sponsored scheme meant that some very intelligent deputy secretary in the central ministry would take 200 crores for something or the other and would define all kinds of criteria, and the state government would have to get the approval of the ministry before the money went down. So we said, look, let's pool all this together into one project for supporting agriculture. Each state will have its own emphasis. Some state may want to do fisheries, somebody else may want to do floriculture. Let them propose projects within this total. Let it be cleared by a committee chaired by the Chief Secretary of the state, to which the Planning Commission and the central government would send representatives. This made a huge difference, because when these things were chaired in Delhi, the Secretary of Agriculture would chair it. He would expect that the Chief Secretary or somebody very senior from the state would come. And since the IAS is after all one biradari, I mean, a chap from the IAS coming from the state to somebody who may 2 years later be cabinet secretary is not going to tell him, forget it, man, this doesn't work. Whereas when you have the same thing chaired by a chief secretary, then the secretary from Delhi doesn't go, he sends his joint secretary. And the chief secretary outranks the joint secretary in any IAS biradari, so he's more able to be persuasive. And we found that was terrific. And I remember telling Dr. Manmohan Singh, you know, we call this the Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana. It's now been renamed, but it's something similar. And we went to Sharad Pawar and said, look, sir, you've got 10 schemes for agriculture. One for floriculture, one for whatever vegetables, one for this thing, that thing. Let's pool them all, give them to the state. Let the state decide what it wants to do. Otherwise, you had a joint secretary on a floriculture scheme writing to every state, what do you want to do in floriculture? It makes no sense at all. And I mentioned to Dr. Manmohan Singh that, you know, this seems to be very popular, because most of the states say, this is a good thing, do it for all the others also. And he said, of course they think it's popular because you've given the power to them. And I said, that's what we should do. And therefore I agree with what Rajiv is saying. You know, we have states at incredible differences.
Yes.
Per capita income difference 5:1. State capacity, huge difference. So frankly, the idea of doing this in the center is just wrong.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's time now to really go down to the states and do that. One question that I had, from you is that I think by 2013 already, the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and I believe you, had started looking at how to revamp the Planning Commission. There were committees, etc., and there was an idea of how to redesign it, etc., etc. Now, my question to you is, and as a member of some of the committees and so on, is that do you think what's come now and what might be in the future, are they similar to the idea that you had of converting this into a think tank and have no financial role, which by the way was sort of objected to by several chief ministers? I'm just asking you the question that does Niti Aayog represent a kind of a continuity that you had in mind, or is it a complete break?
Well, I'm not the right person to comment on Niti Aayog, especially since you're here.
No.
You know what Niti
simply
Aayog
because I'm asking you the question that did you have a similar thought?
No, I
had a similar thought.
I had a different thought. My thought was, number one, the Planning Commission pretends to plan too many things even for the center. And in my view, what I had said was there are certain core sectors where the central government has to do investment, and the Planning Commission should limit itself to that. That would be energy, maybe irrigation, one or two of these, 2 or 3 big things. The rest of the stuff, let's not pretend that we're doing any planning. Second, I had said that, rather than be a think tank, I think the Planning Commission should operate as a hub and spoke activity, linking up with other think tanks. I am deeply opposed to the idea of an in-house think tank, because an in-house think tank will never be self-critical. I mean, I spend a lot of time on the macro modeling. We used to have an input-output model. And I said, look, nowhere in the world is this static kind of input-output modeling done. Sure. So when we did a hub and spoke, we collected a whole lot of think tanks around the country. And we actually gave them some funding. This was Kirit Parikh's idea. But internally, the wretched input-output model still continued. So actually, I was saying we just shouldn't do anything internal. And if you want to be a think tank, you should be a forum for think tanks, where, for example, a Tamil Nadu think tank would produce a totally different perspective from what, say, a Punjab think tank would do. And the job of Niti Aayog would be to reconcile the two. You mentioned, for example, trade policy. And trade policy cannot be left to individual states. There has to be a national trade policy. But if some state has a special difficulty, then maybe you need to get them some support to make them more able to benefit. I would not say that states should be allowed to define their own import policy. That would be an unmitigated disaster.
But
What I said was that we need to reshape the Planning Commission along these lines. But in terms of finance, I felt that the Government of India's investment activity should go through a Planning Commission scrutiny for the major projects. And the Planning Commission and the Finance Ministry would then provide some tension between themselves. After all, the Planning Commission never had any power. It was only an advisory body. Our power rested in the fact that when the Prime Minister finally cleared the Finance Ministry's budget proposals, he had our view that we should do more investment here and less investment there. And it depended on him. Now, the same thing exists today, but today there's nobody feeding that unless there is something in the PMO, because I'm told that Niti Aayog no longer has that role of people bringing their financing proposals to the Commission, and the Commission then feeding them into the process, into the Niti Aayog.
No, it doesn't. Yeah.
So my feeling was that we were doing too much, but for the 4 or 5 big sectors, we needed to do it, and it wasn't as if we were doing it. We were only advising the Prime Minister to see how the Finance Ministry puts these things up. I mean, you could argue that, for example, you could put this all in the finance in the Finance Ministry, but then you don't have a critical input. You could put it in the PMO if you have a small group.
I want to open this up to the question answers.
Yes.
Just to.
But let me finish one thing.
Yeah.
I regret to say that the willingness of people to listen to us on policy was directly connected with the belief that we will affect their budget.
Yes.
The moment, if it's not that we really affected their budget, because if they had done a deal with the PM, it doesn't matter what the deputy chairman says. But not every minister was in that position.
Yep.
So whenever policy issues were raised, they always had this feeling that, you never know, if you don't listen at all to them, they may muck up the budget. So I think that was a negotiating power which presumably Niti didn't have.
I just wanted to assure you that we had continued the practice. We started the practice of consulting state-level think tanks on a quarterly basis.
Okay.
And we'll bring them together, and therefore the Niti Aayog did become, in some sense, the hub of think tank activity and so on. Let me open this up for question answers. Yes.
2 quick questions, please. Yes. Someone from the back there? Yes.
You want a mic?
Why don't you come to front? Yes.
Yeah, come down and shout.
Shout politely.
You don't have to be polite, just shout.
Yes, out. Tell us your name.
Sir, I am Jigyasu. My name is Jigyasu Ahluwalia. So some of us here are aspiring civil servants. So we would want to know that. So we would want to know that, do you think our bureaucracy needs to go through some reforms, and what major reforms they should be? And second is that, what would be your advice to some aspiring civil servants? Thank you.
Look, everybody needs to go through reforms, not just the civil service. Because, frankly, we are very low at the moment in the development spectrum. We've got out of being a low-income economy, we've got to the bottom of the middle-income range, and there's a long way to go. So the short answer is, any group needs reforms. Don't ask me what those reforms should be, because I'm not an HR person, but people should seriously look at that. Second, one reform that should definitely be there is periodic refreshment of views. I mean, the idea that somebody did a BA in 1990 and is therefore an economist is a grave mistake. If somebody is an engineer and went to an economics refresher course, he'd probably end up being a better economist. I don't think that there are enough of these refresher courses. And secondly, I don't think the refresher thing can be done by the institute in Mussoorie, because the institute in Mussoorie is meant to take fresh graduates and give them a little basic training. You need refresher courses where civil servants can be told that, look, these are the two different views on which you will have to pronounce. And one of the biggest problems today, I think there's at an intellectual level a complete agreement that development has to be led by the private sector. Okay? At the same time, there's a profound suspicion of the private sector. And somebody says we are dominated by 1 and 2 and whatever. Now, what is our image? I mean, we are the third largest economy in the world. Do we want to have 2 companies that are in the top 100? And if we do have those 2 companies, under what circumstances will we not call them crony capitalists? Now, I think this would be the most useful thing to give. And by the way, I'm not saying, in my view, all companies want to become crony capitalists. That's true in the United States also. So there's a job of the government, the think tanks, and civil society to create an environment in which, great that you've become big, but you have to be competitive. And I think you can't do worse than get Pradeep Mehta, who's sitting there, to give you lectures on that, because he spent a whole lifetime in bringing the notion of competition as something that enhances efficiency to the public notice. And I think what we then need is an understanding that, look, as long as companies are operating within that environment and they become big, you should celebrate them. But I regret to say that is not the current atmosphere. And you need to think hard about that one. Part of the problem, this is also global, the rise of the digital economy has created a very peculiar circumstance where the first mover has a huge advantage. I mean, Google and Apple. And if you look at the United States, there's intense agony that these guys are dominating our lives. So what is going to happen here? I think we need to keep our mind open. We need to see what's happening globally and engage in that discussion so that we are on a reasonable position when it comes to saying, look, we've got to introduce this discipline. That's my view.
The second question.
Thank you so much, sir. Next and the last question, please.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Montek Singh Ahluwalia. When we see countries in Europe and all across the world selling their thousands of years of history and making billions of dollars, in India, as we see, you talked about think tanks. We have some state tourism departments taking up on tourism, but why aren't we creating up a national level think tank for tourism that we can sell a history of 1,000 years and earn billions of dollars in tourism? That is my question to you, sir.
Well, I don't think you should have I'm totally opposed to maybe sector-specific think tanks for some things that work, but tourism, quite honestly, any halfway decent business school or economics department should sort of do some work on what does it take to improve tourism. And there's no question in my mind that, the scope for tourism is immense. I don't think necessarily this means foreign tourism, by the way. I mean, when this country, which it will, when we, instead of having maybe 300 million people today who perhaps own cars, I don't even think it's 300 million. No, less than that, 25%.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, that's including two-wheelers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if it's
Car
10...
ownership is 3 in 1,000.
Okay, so can we assume that in the next 10 years, what is 3 in 1,000 could easily become 30 in 1,000, okay? All these guys will want to travel within the country. And, I mean, what does it take? That will mean a huge expansion of the service sector. And one of the things you guys have to realize is that this excessive focus on manufacturing, as if services are not really an important part of the economy, is a mistake. So I don't think you need a separate think tank. You need the guys who are plugging tourism to be in the same think tank which is plugging services in general, plugging manufacturing, so that they can be listened to and talk to each other.
Thank you, sir. Yes, the young gentleman.
Hello, sir. My name is Jay. I'm a student in Delhi University. Sir, 2 months back, I was interning in India Today Group. So, sir, there was a buzz around Noida group of media houses that India suffers usually from policy paralysis, where we are very good in making policies, but when it comes to implementation, we fail miserably. So how can we solve this problem?
Yeah, I disagree with the view that we're very good in making policies. We are very good in making slogans. And that's not a small. I'm now talking about the UPA. I'm not talking about the present government, but I'm sure it's also true. See, don't underestimate the importance of slogans, but leave them as what they are. The next thing is targets. You convert a slogan to a target. I mean, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan is a slogan. A target is what are you going to do for agriculture and what are you going to do for defense. And the next thing is, if you're going to modernize agriculture, what are the programs and what are the policies? Programs are different from policies. Programs means that some joint secretary will put forward a program on how to improve fisheries and say, well, if you give 150 crores per year for the next 5 years, I'll do this. And policies are that, look, it's being held up by the following things, and if you change these things, the farmers will do it themselves. We have too little of the latter, too much of the former. And I think we need to kind of break that sort of barrier. When you say implementation, no policy is good if it is not grounded in the capacity to implement. I mean, it's a failure to make a policy if you make a policy that you know is going to get grounded by the time it's. And I think too many of our policies are of that nature. That, by the way, is a big difference between the 1991 reforms. Because in the 1991 reforms, we said abolish import licensing. So somebody who wants to import, he just goes and imports. If we had said create a single window system which is computerized in order to handle import licensing, it would have been an unmitigated disaster. So that's the critical thing. Policies allow free agents to interact with each other in the market, but with a few selective interventions. And if you want import substitution, depreciate the exchange rate. And then leave it to them. And we need a lot more of that kind of thinking. But even today, I think that's a relevant issue because I keep reading in the newspapers that, every ministry is now going to the finance ministry to raise import duties. Of course, ministries, I'm not saying that they're going to raise them or not, but my view is that this is the wrong thing to do. And his predecessor, Arvind Panagriya, who was the first vice chairman of the Niti Aayog, and of all the Niti Aayog or Planning Commission people, he's the only one who's actually a trade economist, right? His conclusion was, and in fact recently wrote in one of the newspapers, that our tendency to raise duties in the last 3 years has been a mistake. And he has another sentence in it which is very interesting. I'm absolutely sure. He said, this has been done without any analysis whatsoever. Now, that's not me saying it, that's Arvind Panagriya saying
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. Please give them a round of applause. Montek Singh ji or Rajiv ji. I would like to invite the director of Bhopal Literature and Art Festival, Raghav Chandra ji, to please come to the dais and present a memento to our discussant and the author as a symbol of love and respect from Bhopal Literature and Art Festival 2023. And please don't go away because the next session is based on cheetahs, the last and the latest. Yes. Yes. All of you must be aware about cheetahs being reintroduced into the nation. So the next